Hello and welcome to Contract Law 101 Part 4. Before I go any further, I have to state that I am not a legal representative, nor can I supply legal counsel. This video and its predecessors are purely tutorial educational purposes only. Anything you take from these videos in an attempt to apply it to a situation that you may be facing, you do so at your own risk, as I will not and cannot accept liability or responsibility if the outcome is detrimental to yourself. And having said that, let's move on to part 4. Okay, so in part 3, I stated towards the end of the video that I would supply evidence to substantiate what I have been talking about from part 1 to part 3. And the reason for that is because without doing that, it would be just simply too easy for skeptics, non-believers, disbelievers, critics to sit there and say, oh, it's just all rhubarb, he's dribbling bullshit. Each to their own, without researching it for themselves or for yourself. How are you going to know? If somebody blindly follows somebody else, and they are susceptible to the consequences they may find or come across for just following along blindly. It's not my intent to inadvertently or purposely drop anybody in the shit. I believe we should all be helping each other out to get around problems that we face that involve government and corporations. If you like, I choose to be a spanner in the works, albeit it might be a small spanner, but every jam that you create in the system, if you view the system as one great big machine, would have to be a good thing. Unfortunately, there's too many cogs in the machine, which are the people who blindly follow without questioning. They are the gears that keep the machine working, and then you have the other bunch of people who oil the machine to keep it running nice and smoothly. So, how did I learn about all this? Well, in 2007, I was enlightened, if you like, to the information of a man who was a part of the free man movement. Now, the free man movement kind of has something to do with all these videos that I've been talking about, but directly but not indirectly. And I know that sounds like a contradiction in terms, but the reality of it is the free man, in the term of its wording, pertains to the government securitized entity. Now, this entity that I was enlightened to somehow was granted, gifted, bestowed upon the title of Guru. And a few months ago I seen a YouTube running around, or a YouTube video running around, where the title of wasn't Guru, it was grandfather of the free man movement. Now, this entity, I don't know whether he still does. I've had nothing to do with him for the better part of 10 years. But when I did encounter him in 2007, thereabouts, or 2009, so it's between those 2 years, he was holding seminars, and I have to admit, first hearing about this, I was kind of in awe, because I was completely oblivious to it, as most people are. And the thing I found with him was that he talked the talk really well. I actually got to see this man perform in court. I was in the audience, and the entity that was in the dock was not the entity that was described as the guru who talked the talk. Now, there could be many reasons for that. One that I tend to believe more than anything else was that whilst he talked the talk, he didn't actually have a handle on it. He kind of, to an extent, big-noted himself with comments like, "Oh, I told Judgy Wudgy," and they were his words. And I thought, that's ballsy. Okay, this guy might be worth listening to. And like I said, he talked the talk. But actually watching him perform, he could talk it, but he didn't walk it. In the court case that I was privy to, what I seen was a man who tried various techniques that seemed to get him nowhere. Now, when this man was operating with the title as Guru, he was putting out workshop manuals that you naturally had to pay for. And these workshop manuals had templates on how to deal with certain scenario situations. And so this guru also he lays claim that he filed to capture under a UCC1. Now, UCC1 is Universal Commercial Code 1, okay? Now, he tried to capture the straw man, the government securitized entity. Not knowing it then, but realizing it later on, I came to the conclusion that that would have been a physical impossibility simply because A, he didn't create it, and therefore B, he didn't own it. And as the law states, you can only own and control what you create, as what I stated in part 2. So whether that was just a bit of bullshit to impress people, I don't know. But thinking back across it, well, sure, you can file anything you want. Whether you're successful in your filing, well, that's a different thing altogether. And whilst he laid claim that he filed a UCC1 against the straw man government securitized entity, I don't ever recall hearing or seeing or reading anything from him or of his work of where that filing actually succeeded. And I'm betting it didn't. But anyway, being new to the game, I used the guru's templates. Now, his templates in dealing with corporate bodies, government departments, they were documents 5 pages thick, and it pretty much had something to the tune of 15 or 17 points that was demanded of whoever you sent that document to show and prove. Now, in 2009, a government department decided to instigate a war against my wallet, and I was using his documents, and I couldn't understand why the documents were being ignored. They all seemed to be above board, legal, factual, correct, but it was just like they received it, threw it in the bin, and had another crack at it. I couldn't understand why. Well, towards the end of that paper warfare with that particular department, which ended in 2011, and the way it ended was that they committed a violation against the federal legislation, which was it is illegal to garnish the entirety of somebody's wages in lieu of a debt. And keep in mind, it wasn't a guaranteed debt, it was a presumption of debt. In a part of the document, it was show and prove that this debt actually exists, and various other points that I wanted them to show and prove to make their life a little bit more difficult in proving and showing this information. And they never did. But what they decided to do was to freeze the bank account I was using. I was working at the time. And in the bank account, when they committed this act on the 14th of April 2011, they froze the bank account, they flushed the funds, which was $2,000, it was all in wages, and I still have the paperwork and documentation to prove it was still all wages. And then I found out by the actual bank itself that there was a $10,000 garnish on it. Well, yeah, $10,000 garnish, which meant that these idiots expected me somehow to be able to get to work, and I was paid on a fortnightly basis, and no, it wasn't welfare. So get to work, buy fuel for the car to get to work, pay rent, buy food, survive basically, on nothing. Because as soon as the money went into the account from the employer, they would have flushed it again. And yet they put a $10,000 garnish on the account, and it's like, you're a lot of idiots. How do you expect somebody to survive and pay you on nothing? How the hell does that work? So it got left at that point as to a stalemate, for lack of better words. I didn't move forward. They didn't move forward. Now this happened started in 2009, ended in 2011. And as a point of curiosity, I decided to ring this organisation, this department, in 2018, I think. And at the time, in 2011, when they did what they did, they alleged, never proved, they just alleged that there was an outstanding debt of $22,000. And from 2011, when they basically made me destitute instantly by doing their action, I hadn't been working from 2011, and I'm still not working. Now, in 2018, I was presented with the opportunity for possible work. They already screwed up my life enough. My life turned from bearable to absolute utter misery and shit. And I notified the prospective employer of what I had endured. And whilst, yes, I'd like to take the job, I can't guarantee that that particular government department won't reenact the same action it did before. And so the potential employer wanted a letter from this particular department stating that they would not commit the same action that they did before. And according to the department, they were happy to do that, but they wanted a postal address to send the letter to. And I said, well, I'm not going to give you a postal address, but I authorise you, without liability, to email the letter to me. And they said, oh, well, we can't do that under the Privacy Act. And I said, well, it's my email address, and I'm authorising you to do it. I'm not going to give you a letterbox address. It's not going to happen. And naturally, so they didn't send the letter, and so I didn't get the job. Great how the government and its various departments work. And so out of curiosity, I asked them, I said, what's the alleged debt standing at? I mean, we're talking about, what, in 2011 it was, what was it alleged, $22,000 or something or other? And they said, oh no, it's up to $86,000 now. And I said, you what? They said, yeah, it's up to $86,000. I said, you better go out and readjust your records. And they said, why? I said, because if you care to check with the ATO, you'll see that I haven't submitted a tax return since you guys rendered me destitute in 2011. And they said, oh yeah, well, we have checked with the ATO. We can go back as far as 3 years, every 3 years. And yeah, we agree, you haven't submitted a tax return. I said, so how are you coming to the conclusion of an allegement that it's now $86,000 if there's been no income generated? How can you be calculating your figures? 7 or 8 years times 0 is still 0. How do you get this? And of course they didn't want to answer that question, did they? Because it could be, well, I don't know, fraudulent maybe, just at a wee guess. Anyway, so that department and I are locked in a Mexican standoff, if you like, without the firearms, where neither of us will go forward. And the fact of the matter is, if they had such a solid case, you would think, being the government department, that they would have hauled my ass into court. Hasn't happened. And they can't say they don't know where I live. The only thing that I have as a traceable thing regarding government is a driver's license. So they know where I reside. But they haven't done anything. Must be a reason for it. But anyway, towards the end of 2011, another department, and not necessarily a government department, but it sure as hell is aligned to the government. It's called the ATO. And the ATO started jumping up and down, alleging that I hadn't lodged tax returns for X amount of years. This was prior to 2009. The years that I had not submitted was prior to 2009. And when I looked upon their letter, I noted that one of the years that they nominated, I actually had submitted a tax return. So I sent them back a letter stating, readjust your records on the basis of this. You've nominated a year that I have a tax return sitting right here. And sent that letter off to them. And they sent a response, as I expected them to do, with the same years that they used before, minus the 1 year that I showed that, hey, recheck your records, I've submitted a tax return for that year. And along with their letter, their response, was a nasty threat. Now, I can't speak for everybody, but personally, I don't take kindly to threats. In fact, I get rather irritable when somebody threatens me. And when somebody threatens me and I get irritable, it's not a good place to be. So I quickly assessed that this shit isn't going to go away unless I make it go away. So the first thing I had to do was figure out, well, why the hell is the 5-page document that I sent to the other government department not working? Why were they just chucking it in the bin like I never sent it? Well, the reason being, because I had to read the document over again. I thought, yeah, well, it's all fine above board and everything's key. Why? And then I looked at it again, and there is a thing in when you send a letter called a preamble. And basically what it is in the formulation of a letter, you write your name, and you should write care of, number, street address. Don't write just street number and street address. Put care of, because what that means is that's only where you get the mail sent to. That doesn't mean you reside there. So that gives you a little buffer. Albeit it might be a little white lie, big deal. It just provides you with a little buffer. So name, obviously in Old English format, because you don't want to be trading as a corporation. So your name, so if you send a letter, your name is in upper and lower case, Old English format. Care of whatever street number, whatever street, suburb or town, state, and postcode. Now the thing about postcode is it's not legitimately a postcode. It's a different code. And what it actually is a military code. So when the military plans out battle strategies of areas that they're going to do whatever it is they're going to do, they lay out a map and it has all what we would define as postcodes written all over them. But when you send a letter, when it comes to putting the postcode down, put it in closed brackets. So your postcode sits in the middle there and it's closed brackets. And that notifies the recipient or the recipients of that letter that you don't actually reside in a postal suburb. You reside, or your letters go to a military code. You still get the letter, but it's a military code. They know exactly what it means. And then further down on the left hand side, you've got the recipient's name, which you put in upper and lower case, and next to that you put trading as, and you put their name again in all capitals, because like I said, the dead can't talk to the living, right? Now the general recipient of the letter may not want to view themselves as a corporate entity, and so you do the courtesy thing as you were taught in Old English format, upper and lower case for their name, but next to it you put trading as and their name in full capital letters. So they have to acknowledge that letter because they recognize their name, and usually higher tiers or the higher echelon of government departments know the scam. The lower drones that answer phones and just randomly respond to bullshit letters don't know. And that's the whole thing about this. The upper the echelon in the system know the scam. The lower drones are just like the minions that oil the machine. And then you normally put RE, which is basically for what the matter is about. Excuse me. They'll probably have a reference number, otherwise known as a customer reference number. You put that in, and then you write a preamble. Now, the preambles that were written on documents I was sent in were in probably 18 to 24 point bold black capital writing, so they couldn't not see it. And so, because this was a template off the alleged guru's workshop templates, it had the preamble stated, I, name in lowercase, hereby from this point, by this point herein, known as principal. And principal means that you are the primary, not a secondary. Okay, so what you're trying to elaborate for whoever's reading it is that I am not a legal fiction. I am the living body or the living soul, the living human being, by nominating yourself as a principal, because anything else, like your government securitized entity, would be a secondary to you, but as far as they want to view it, that's the primary. And that's what you're trying to separate, is the joinder. You're trying not to, or you're trying to elaborate or prove that you are not a legal fiction or the government securitized entity. You're a living, breathing, sentient biological organism. So you have to separate the joinder. So I, such and such name, herein, from this point onwards, define as principal. Actually, no, it's not even that. What the first couple of lines state is, in I think it's 24 point black ink capital that I put it down as, notice to agent is notice to principal, notice to principal is notice to agent. And what that means is, if the silly receptionist receives a letter and signs for it, it is her obligation and duty at that point to assess who the letter is actually being sent to, and it is her obligation to pass it on. Now, it doesn't matter whether she passes it on to her supervisor and they pass it on to somebody else, and until it gets to who it's got to go to, it's their obligation, not yours. So notice to agent is notice to principal, notice to principal is notice to agent. So it's an up and down seesaw effect. If you put on notice the lowest person on the saw, it's their responsibility to notice or notify the highest point, right? And vice versa. If it gets delivered directly to who you want to send it to, who is the principal, it's their obligation to put on notice their servants, if you like, their subservient employees. And then it says, after that it says in a slightly smaller font, I such and such hereby in at this point in time note myself as principal and will address myself as principal, or something along those lines, basically to break the joinder. But further on, a little bit down from that, it says, I, the free man on the land. Now, that can be misconstrued, because at the end of the day, whilst you recognise within yourself, because you were born or had a live nativity without a manifest, you were born free, and a manifest didn't arrive until your parents abandoned you and lo and behold, birth certificate pops up for you. Somebody else's somebody else has conceived an entity for you, which is not you. But, you know, how can somebody else produce an ID for you when they don't know you? They can't. So it's a perceptual ID. So in this guy's document from his template, said, I, the free man on the land, hereby make notice as principal, rudder. And that's where the flaw was in the document, was I the free man on the land. Well, the free man also pertains to the straw man, right? Because they did away with it. They did away with your live nativity. So clearly, as far as they're concerned, you're no longer alive. And so how can you claim yourself to be a free man? You've got no manifest to prove you are a free man, because you do actually have a manifest called a birth certificate that they created. So you're trying to attest to being a free man or free woman or free child, which that's okay. You can think that if you want. Nobody gives a shit what you think. Proving it is a different thing altogether. And that's where the flaw was, because corporate entities, government departments, yada yada yada, they're a corporation, which means they operate in the land of the dead. So if you're trying to declare yourself to be a free man, you can't talk to the dead, and the dead can't talk to you. And that's where the flaw was. And I didn't realise that until some time after, and it's like, can't figure out why these documents don't work. And then it clicked to me: you can't drag the public into the private, and you can't drag the private into the public. That just can't work. You know, it's kind of like you'd have to go to somebody, a fortune teller that looks in a crystal ball and says, "Oh yeah, you're talking to your Uncle Dave." It's bar humbug. So that's where the flaw was: trying to declare being a free man and talking to the land of the dead. You can't do that, and they can't do it. You know, there's a brick wall between the two. You can't do it this way, and they can't do it that way. And this is why the whole government securitized entity thing that they've labelled you with allows them, the land of the dead, to talk to one of their own that they created as a deceased entity. Anyway, so I just thought, well, to hell with it. I'm going to change the document. I've got no choice. I've got to do something. I'm getting fed up with being harassed by government departments or government-associated companies. And so I gave it a little thought, and I thought, well, okay, I'll leave the preamble, but I will cut out the free man on the land bit. So i.e., I just nominated myself as the principal. I am the primary entity here. That was notice that I am not speaking to you on behalf of your ruler's creation. I refuse to accept that I am a government securitized entity. I am a principal, primary. I have life force. And where the rest of the document from the templates were, ended up being 5 pages thick. This one I made up was 1 page, from go to woe: name, recipient, the preamble, and my points that I wanted them to show and prove. Now, there was only 4 points, whereas the other template that didn't work, it had like 15 or 17 points on it. It was just absolutely ridiculous. If you were to have to look at it and were expected to respond, you'd go, too much trouble, not interested, and throw it in the bin, too hard basket. So I made it really simple for them, but I was very cunning about how I did it. The first point in the document that I sent to the ATO was show that the addressee on your letter, or show and prove that the addressee on your letter and I are one and the same entity. Now, by putting that in that context was a double-edged sword for the ATO, because if they were going to try and prove that I was a living, breathing, sentient biological organism, and their addressee on their letter was all capitals version, which is the government securitized entity, that's 2 entities into 1 body. You can't have that for starters. 2 entities is 2 entities, not 2 into 1. So that would have unraveled the scam, right? The ATO is aware of the scam. The second point was show and prove which crown you represent. Now, when you mention the crown in general conversation, most people's head jump to the monarch. Yeah, that's understandable. It's fair enough. But there are actually 2 crowns. There is the monarch as the crown, and there is another crown. I was almost going to say monarch, but it's not a monarch. There's another crown that's called the Crown Corporation. And the Crown Corporation excuse me, is 1 square kilometre in the centre of London. Now, just as a sideways step here for you to question what the hell, Queen Elizabeth claims that her lineage dates back to Egyptian days. Now, anybody who's aware of the monarch is also aware that they're also a false monarch, because they're not the monarch of England. They're Gaults. That's what they're called, Gaults, Gaults. And so they're not originally from England. Their ancestry does not come from England. It comes from Sicily or somewhere, I think. But anyway, the document said, show which crown you represent. Because they have to represent somebody. If they're in Australia, they're either representing the monarch, which they should be under 1901 Commonwealth of Australia Constitution, because that's who the country pledged allegiance to. So it was, show which crown you represent. Is it Her Most Excellent Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, ruler of England, United Kingdom, Wales and her dominions, which means lands, because Captain Cook stuck a stick in the ground with a rag on it and he claimed the land for King George III, and so therefore she inherited the land. So I'll just rephrase what I said. Show which crown you represent. Is it, and it has to be worded this way, show which crown you represent. Is it A, Her Most Excellent Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, ruler of England and Wales and other dominions? Or B, is it Her Majesty, the Crown in right of England? And it's very specific for B that you word it that way, because it separates between the monarch and the Crown Corporation. And this is how stupid it is with this situation, just putting the document aside for a minute. If Queen Lizzie owns the land, if she walks around England as Elizabeth of the House of Windsor, because that's her last name, she can go wherever the hell she likes. But if she walks around England in her full capacitance with the crown on her head, to walk through the centre of London, she has to send a letter of permission, in other words, ask for permission, to walk through the centre of London whilst walking around as the monarch of England. Now you've got to ask yourself, if this old bag of bones can date her lineage back to Egyptian days, and her family will leave out the whole illegal or irrelevant monarch thing, but we'll just go with the flow. If her family has been ruling England for hundreds of years, doesn't it seem odd that Lizzie would need permission to walk in her own backyard? Because you see, the monarch, as far as the Queen is concerned, when she puts on that crown, it is a corporation. It's a corporate crown. Okay? She is in full capacitance corporation of the monarch. So if she wants to walk through the centre of London as full capacitance Queen of the monarch, she has to ask permission, because she's walking into foreign territory as a ruler. A lot of people don't know that. If you look very closely at legitimate pictures of the monarch's crown, where the horns come up to meet the spire, they do that. Whereas the ones on police epaulets, the horns on the crown do that. They sink into the hat, whereas Lizzie's crown points up, holding the spire up. And that's how you can tell who the cops are working for. They're working for the Crown Corporation through the government, because the government's working for the Crown Corporation. The Crown Corporation's probably working for the elites, and on it goes. But that's how you tell the difference. Anyway, getting back to the document. So it's, show which crown you represent. Is it Her Most Excellent Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, ruler of England and Wales and other dominions? Or B, is it Her Majesty the Crown in right of England? And it has to be worded that way, because it separates the two. And when you're dealing with somebody like the ATO, you have to be specific, because if you leave an area open where they can misconstrue to work against you, they'll do it. The third point in the document I sent them was show and prove an alleged contract, or the alleged contract. That was very simple. And the fourth point, equally as simple again, show and prove where the alleged breach in the alleged contract is. Well, it didn't even say is, it was just show and prove where the alleged breach in the alleged contract. Now, I shipped that off. And so, what I suggest everybody and anybody does, certainly if they're dealing with government departments and paper warfare, buy yourself a stack of a stack of these things, all right? When it's got details that you need to fill out in the back, and you buy a stack of these as well. Okay, now these things get stuck to the front of these. Ozpost rips off one half, and there's a section on it. I mean, you probably filled these out before, but for those who haven't and don't know, you can itemize what you want done or how you want this envelope delivered. You can just have it signed for, delivery signature, and sorry, the lighting's a bit bad. Person to person is another one. You pay a little bit more for the delivery, but the point about signature of acceptance or delivery confirmation, which means they have to get a signature, and if you put down person to person, then the postal delivery entity has to deliver the envelope to the addressee of the letter, regardless of that his secretary is the only one that, or their secretary is the only one that takes the letters. He is obligated, because you're paying for a service, and he has to honour that service because you've paid for it. So he's got to deliver it to who your letter is addressed to. It's not addressed to the secretary. Doesn't matter if that's her job, that, oh, I accept all letters. Don't give a shit, love. This is stating must be delivered person to person. In most cases, postal delivery posties don't give a shit. As long as somebody signs for it, that's all they care about. Get the hell out of there. And that's actually not an issue, because the preamble says notice to agent is notice to principal, and notice to principal is notice to agent. So you may get swindled on a little bit of money for person to person, but if that be the case, then it's up to the secretary to hand the letter to the intended addressee. So every time I send a letter, I send it with one of those envelopes, or stacked in one of those envelopes. Now, I got a response to the 4-point document that I sent them, and oddly enough, I did get a response, but it wasn't the response I was expecting. Now, I'll read out what the document says and then I'll show it. But it states, I mean, it's got the usual preamble, my name, blah, 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 address and everything else. And it says, I refer to your correspondence dated the 6th of February 2012, which makes reference to an indication or an intention to prosecute letter issued to you on the 11th of January 2012. And that was the threat they made. And what the threat actually was, if you do not submit these tax returns by this date, you will be charged or fined $110 a day plus 10% GDP for every day they're late. That's what irritated me. Ain't gonna happen to us. Not in this lifetime. And that's why I sent that 4-point letter. It goes on further to say, I wish to advise that any correspondence that the office sends is issued to your care of address, maintained in the Australian Taxation Office, taxpayer systems, ATO records currently your residential address as being blah 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 blah. And under that it says, in respect to your question whether the ATO is a corporation, I advise that the ATO is not a corporation and is not incorporated. Now, if you're wanting, desiring, needing to trade in commerce, money, you have to have a registered business. It's by law. You can't avoid it. You don't have to register for GST unless your annual turnover is greater than $50,000 a year. But nonetheless, if you trade 1 cent, you have to have a registered business to do it. And yet the ATO is claiming in this letter that they are not a corporation, nor are they incorporated, and yet they trade in money. And there's the letter. I know it's all backwards and upside down, but I can't help that. It's just the way that the tablet's doing it. So, I have on a partitioned hard drive on my computer that needs formatting, of course, a video of where some guy, can't remember his name, I mean I haven't looked at this video for 10 years, some guy who challenged the ATO to the extent of just and fair taxes as opposed to the outrageous taxes everybody pays. Now, from what I recall from this video, there was 2 filings of this matter, and if memory serves me correctly, the first one was in 2011. Oh, and by the way, before I go any further, I looked this up tonight. I can't find it anywhere in any search engine. It's like it never existed. And there's only one reason for that. They don't want people to cotton onto it. Because if they do, then they're going to have, and we'll say for round even figures just to keep everything all neat and tidy, 25 million tax-paying people saying, you owe me all my money back plus interest. That if they think the government or the country's in debt now, 25 million taxpayers who have paid tax for, we'll just go with 65 years. 65 years worth of taxes for 25 million people, and yes, the tax bracket jumps up and down depending upon how much one earns, but like I said, to keep it all nice and tight, neat and tidy, just as purely example point, 25 million people all paying tax, and they didn't have to be. All that money's got to be reimbursed plus interest. Just consider that for a minute as to how much money we're actually talking about. Because A, you have to be a registered business in order to trade in money. And what's the ATO trade in? Trades in money. It steals a percentage of your wages before you even get to see it through your employer. So they're aiding and abetting a criminal act. But anyway, the video depicted of this guy who went to court against the ATO to establish or justify what is considered to be a fair and just tax. Now, if memory serves me correctly, there was 2 court cases, one in 2011 and the other one was in 2013. Now, the presiding judge, according to this video, deliberated with his conclusion in finding that it was proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the ATO is either a illegitimate or incorrectly set up company. And there's the proof of it. There's the proof that the ATO is an illegitimate or incorrectly set up company, not a corporation and not incorporated. You've got to be a corporation to trade in money. You have to be a registered business. Now, when this was first going down in 2011, back in the day when ASICs used to list companies and their registered ABN numbers, I listed ATO, and there was about 15 or 17 of them, and all of them bar 2 companies were in capital letters, and all of them bar 1 had registered ABNs, which means the one that didn't have an ABN was the legitimate ATO, who this mob, through this letter, state that the ATO is not a corporation, nor is it incorporated. That's fraud. So I had that knowledge already up my sleeve before they sent this letter. And so the 2013 case, the presiding justice, in his deliberation, concluded that there is not a law that the Commissioner for Taxation can rely upon to withhold or withdraw tax from anybody. Openly committing fraud, openly not operating true correct as a company, and trading in money. And here's the thing. I also found out that if you trade with a company that is either illegitimate or incorrectly set up, you risk a 7-year jail sentence. And the reason nobody's been jailed for this is because if they did, it would also let the cat out of the bag and they would be in deep shit. Point blank. I guess at some stage I'm going to have to break out my computer and format it. And it's not that it's a difficult job, it's just time consuming and a pain in the ass. But I will have to do it at some point, and therefore I can transfer the video in question onto the tablet and I can upload it to YouTube. Don't ask me when that's going to happen. It's when I've got the time to do it, or when I get around to it, or whether I can be bothered. And to an extent I can be bothered, so it's just pretty much time and when. But that's the proof of that. The ATO, their letterhead, signed by Greg Williams, Deputy Commissioner of Taxation. Keep in mind this dates back to 2012, so clearly he probably is not the Deputy Commissioner. But there it is. So if I can find the video of where this person who challenged the ATO, and it was either in the Supreme Court or the High Court, but like I said, I did a listing for it, doesn't turn up anything. I even went so far as cases between 2011 and 2013 against the ATO, and I couldn't even find the name of the guy. Last I heard of, after the 2013 case, the guy that challenged the ATO, they grabbed him in the middle of the night, he was sick in bed, and they locked him up in Wacol Prison in Queensland. So, yeah, you know, when you get too close, be very, very wary and very, very careful. I mean, I don't give a shit, really, from my perspective. Other examples of contract and contract law: your driver's license. When you go to sign your John Doe on it, whether renewing it or first receiving it, most people have the perception that they're just signing the acceptance of the driver's license. No, what they're actually signing is an agreement to the Road Traffic Management Act 1995. So it is actually a contract. However, due to key requirement number 2, full disclosure, they don't tell you to go and read it. They don't even mention it. So there's the flaw in the contract. It's an invalid contract. It's not legally binding because nobody showed you or told you what to go and read. They just made the assumption that, oh yeah, you've already read that. Didn't know I had to. And whilst police will sit there and quote ignorance of the law as no excuse, I find that after educating myself in law, it is the police who are most ignorant. There's also another law where you get done for speeding and the copper wants to infringe upon you, there must be an injured party. And I tried looking for this law the other day too. It's not going around anywhere online either. But the law actually states attempting to solicit funds for commercial compensation where nobody is harmed is a criminal act because it's fraud. I think it comes under the Securities Act, or it might come under part of the Act of Fraud, because you're being expected to pay commercial compensation for a non-injured party. They have to have an injured party to do it. If you haven't hit anybody when you got pulled over, or damaged anybody or harmed anybody when you got pulled over for speeding, that copper at that point, the moment he hands you an infringement notice, is committing a criminal act. The census. They tell you got to fill it out, you've got to hand it in. It's a paper document. You fill it out, and keeping in mind when you sign it, you're attesting to everything on that document being true, complete, concise, and not misleading. It's actually a contract. So the first time you fill one out, you've just resigned yourself to filling it out for the rest of your life every 5 years. Now, that's another invalid contract. Why? Because they haven't fully disclosed what's done with the documentation you put on it. They might tell you, oh, it sits on an Australian database, and it might not. Where's the equal consideration? Where's the equal contribution? There isn't any. You fill it out, they write it down as statistically. So what are they basically saying? Well, every business has to do a yearly stock take, except the government. They do one every 5 years. That's what the census form is. It's a stock take. Remember, when they salvaged you under maritime law of salvage rights, you became chattel, their property. So you register a car. You don't own it. You relinquish the ownership of it. Same as parents that fill out child birth docs, register birth docs. Anything you register, you're relinquishing your ownership of it, even down to the white goods. In fact, there was a court case a few years ago now in Queensland where the presiding justice, it had to be a justice because it wasn't a small court, wasn't a magistrate's court or local district court, so it had to be either the Supreme Court or the High Court, but it was quoted by the justice saying that all property, inclusive of people, is property of the Brigalow Corporation. Brigalow Corporation is the registered company in Washington DC, and their trading name is Queensland State Government. So everybody who resides in Queensland, lives in Queensland, has property in Queensland, you don't own it, and you don't even own yourself. As far as they're concerned, they own you. Voting, it's a contract, but it's a contract of force. But the problem with it is, where the catch comes into it, is that you registered to vote with the Australian Electoral Commission. So you relinquished your titleship to not vote by registering to vote. And this is why voting goes from being a legal right to a mandatorial obligation. Right? And the fact that they force you, and how they force you, is by coercion, blackmail and intimidation. Why? Because if you don't vote, they're quite happy to send you an infringement notice. So now you've got to ask yourself, with all the things that are going on and all the people who have voted, that turns out that government are just doing whatever the hell they want, what is your vote actually worth? What's its value? Well, people say, well, I vote, it means I get a say into how this country goes. Well, if that be the case, that means you're part of the blame for COVID and all the draconian tyranny that we've been encountering for the past 3 years. Well, they don't want to hear that. So, what's the reality? What's the value of somebody's vote? Whatever the infringement notice is. However much the fine is, that's what your vote's worth. To them, not to you, to them. So, voting, yeah, it's contractual, but it's contractual by force. As far as the legislation states, every Australian has an obligation. Not if you don't sign up to register, you don't. And that's the problem. People signed up to register. And now people who are aware of this and don't like what's going on are trying to find a way around voting. It's really simple. You send the AEC a letter saying, due to my recent enlightenment and finding God, my religion decrees that I cannot pray to two gods. Now you can see why the last census asked the question, do you have a religion? Do you have a faith? You see, every time government asks a specific question like that, it's not to find out whether they can accommodate you, it's to find out whether they can do something about it to screw you up so it leaves you with no other option, you've got to vote. But that's the way around it, is that you found religion, you have a faith, you have a belief, and your faith and your religion says that it's a cardinal sin to vote for two gods or to pray to two gods. Government thinks it's God. You can't work for two masters, basically. It's either God that you want to work for or it's the government you want to work for. And that's how you get around it. Or you could turn around and say, due to the current situation of the way politics is running in this country, I hold firm the belief that there is no electoral candidate that is worth my vote in voting for. They don't want you to waste your vote, and they'll probably just sit there and say, well, you still have to vote. And if that be the case, well, you may as well vote for Mickey Mouse, because it's just as much bullshit as what the politicians are. And what are they going to do? You're going to fine them. They're going to fine you. Send it back to them. Because remember, they're going to send you a letter in the capital letter sense of your name. Who are they talking to? Not you. They're talking to their creation. Like I said, when you send a letter back to them, for whatever reason, if you don't want to deal with the matter, you put down unknown of the entity of which you speak. You don't know who this legal fiction is, who this government-created securitized entity is. You've got no idea who it is. You've just been given or left with the perception that when you see the name, it's you. And it's not. It's not you. It's theirs. It's their creation. So you don't know who that entity is. It could be anybody or anything. But for those who don't know who they are, they comply to the bullshit. And then they complain about how they have to jump through hoops when they're told to. Well, they don't bother educating themselves outside of the indoctrination of education that they received. It's nobody's fault bar their own. I left high school at 15 due to family reasons. And I have learnt more in life experience and how to deal with the problems that I face because I had to educate myself on how to deal with them. I've learnt more in that than I ever would have learnt in the indoctrination of education. The only three things that really matter as far as the educational curriculum is concerned is English, maths, science, okay, maybe four things, spelling. The rest of it is bullshit. It's unnecessary. Who cares where Italy is? Who gives a damn where the Andes are? Why do you need to know? Unless you're going to go there, are you? No. So why do you need to learn it? And what's the point of learning history? It's well known that the victors of war rewrite history to suit their own agenda. So you can't believe a damn bloody word of history. You can't believe a damn word of anything you learn in the educational curriculum. What you've learned is what they want you to learn, not what you need to learn or what you should learn. The only way you learn of what you should learn is by educating yourself in it. They're not going to tell you. That's why I educated myself in law, in two facets of law. The corporate law, which is contract law, and common law, which they don't acknowledge anymore. So if you keep getting screwed over because you don't know how to deal with corporate society, and when I say society, I'm talking about cops, courts, anybody else, council, government, anybody who gives a perception that they have authority over you, If you get screwed over by them, it's because you haven't educated yourself on how to deal with them. The first and foremost thing, if you really wanted to get snide with them, and they have a problem with this, produce the document with my verifiable wet ink signature attesting to me bestowing power to you, or authority of power to you over me. And you know they can't. You know they won't. What's the best they're going to come up with? Registered child birth docs. Well, I'm sorry, but my parents spoke on my behalf. They didn't consult with me, and they couldn't have consulted with you. Why? Because you were knee-high to a dandelion and didn't know the difference between jack and So it's an invalid contract. But if you want to get around the problem, challenge them. Make them work for it. Don't just bend over and do what they say because they think they have the power of position to do so. Sure, they may threaten you with court action. They may threaten you with jail. They can make all the threats they bloody well like. It doesn't negate the fact that, hey, I'm only asking for you to clarify so I can validate your claim. That's what it is in contract law. Prove it so I can validate your claim. If you don't, I'm not going to stick my hand in my pocket because you said I've got to throw $10,000 at you. It's not going to happen. Prove I owe it to you. So, you've got an obligation. Everybody's got an obligation to the law. Okay, that's what you say. Now prove it. And they won't because they can't. I've had cops turn around to me and say, everybody's got an obligation to the law. I said, well, whilst that might be the status quo and the mentality of thought, prove it. Prove I've got to do what you say. I'm a police officer. That's a job description. That doesn't prove jack shit. And to go one step further, you weren't born with authority, dickhead. Your authority comes from that bloody bit of cotton, badly cut I might add, that has bestowed you with power of authority. And that's fine. The government can bestow you with whatever power of authority they damn well like. But I never gave you power of authority over me. So that's where your authority stops. They won't like it, because why? You're challenging their authority, and they don't like that. But it's valid. This is why, when you come to a shitty scenario with a cop, there's no point in arguing with him. Just let him do what he wants to do. He's a dickhead. He'll prove he's a dickhead, and chances are you probably know he's a dickhead, because he doesn't know the law. He's much the same as the mentality of the vaxxed people at the moment. Because the government says this, and the media pushes the narrative of that, the vaxxed people want to sit there and piss rain down on unvaxxed people. And yet, they can't hide the statistics. Hospitals are inundated with people who have got bloody Omicron virus, and most of them are vaxxed. I mean, if one was truly to believe that the unvaxxed are the super spreaders, we should be like lepers, not unvaxxed. There's more of them than there are of us. There's more vaxxed people out there than there are unvaxxed. So how can it be that the unvaxxed are super spreaders when they're not in hospital as a majority? The vaxxed outnumber us, and we can't go to pubs, clubs, and everything else. How can we be the super spreaders? We can't be. It's a physical impossibility. The medical science even says not possible. Novak Djokovic, natural immunity. But they made such a shit show circus out of the whole bloody event, they were left with no choice but to kick him out of the country to try and save face. The only thing they've succeeded in doing is pissing off the unvaxxed even more. You know, the idiot minister Hawke, who decided to cancel Djokovic's bloody visa. His comment that I read in the paper today was, oh, well, he was a serious threat to public order because he may influence others to emulate his behaviour. I thought, if you thought he was a threat to public order just for that, you've kicked him out of the country. Watch what happens in the next couple of months. If the government thought that the police had a handle on this shit and controlling people, that's long gone now. People aren't going to wait for an excuse. People are just going to lose their shit and go ape shit. And rightly so. We've been forced, not by our choice, forced to resort to a tactic that probably nobody wanted to do. The police are quite happy to pepper spray anybody they deem fit. The law says you can use equal force. So just think about it. They throw a punch, you throw a punch. It's equal force. The thing is, if you're going to go down that road, chances are you're going to be charged with assault, even though they started it. So if you're going to plant one on a cop, make it worth your while hospitalise him, because you've got to make it worth the charge, otherwise it was futile. And that's what it's going to come down to. The people are going to lose their shit because it's on a tipping point. Give it a couple of months, just watch what happens. In fact, I dare go so far as to say, wait for the next election. Wait for the outcome of that and watch what happens. But there it is, Contract Law 101 Part 4. The proof that it works, because I haven't heard from the ATO since 2012. We're now in 2023. Are we? 2023? 2022. I'm getting ahead of myself. So 10 years I haven't heard from them. Now you'd have to ask yourself this one very simple fundamental question. If I'm full of shit, why hasn't the ATO, who knows where I live, come and have me arrested and charged to face court? And people I've explained this to say, oh, it'll happen. Well, what are they waiting for? A written invitation? If I've done so wrong, why haven't they done anything now? I'll give you an example. Paul Hogan made the movie Crocodile Dundee, and the Australian Taxation Office claimed or alleged that he didn't pay tax on the profit margin, which was $17 million. You may have remembered a 60-minute interview about it, and Hogs turned around and said, you think the ATO's tough? Come to America and play with the IRS. You'll know what taxation's all about then. And as he looked into the camera, he turned around and said, if you think you got something on me, come and get me. But the ATO is, for all intents and purposes, not entirely stupid, but they're not super bright either. They waited for his mother to pass, because they knew he'd fly back from the United States to bury his mother. And that's exactly what happened. His mother passed, he flew back from the States to bury his mother, and then they nabbed him. And it went quiet for about a week. And then there was a news report that said Paul Hogan had been fined $100,000 for tax evasion. Just crunch the figures on that. $17 million profit, allegedly avoided paying tax, was fined $100,000. He paid less than 0.1% tax, if the news report is true that he paid $100,000. Less than 0.1%. Even at 10% would have been 1.7 million out of 17 million. So clearly the numbers didn't gel. And straight off the bat I thought, it's bullshit news. I think Hogs did exactly what I've been explaining in these videos, not into such detail over 4 videos, but I think he turned around to him and said, taxation is voluntary, you can't make it mandatory, although you've swindled a scenario to make it mandatory. And here's the thing, I'm an ex-Australian patriot. I had a show, I've had a couple of shows in this country. I used to be the ambassador for tourism. Throw another shrimp on the barbie. Do you honestly think people don't listen or take note of what I say? And how hard do you think it would be for me to tell 25, 27 million Australians the truth? And that makes more sense as to why there was a press release saying that Hogs paid $100,000. I reckon he threatened them. And I reckon he threatened them with leaking the truth. Because the last thing that the country or the government or the ATO could handle is absolute riot and chaos and mayhem over taxation. So I think a deal was done. Hogs, jump back on your plane, piss off back to America, don't come back. You won't be fined, shut your mouth, go away. And that's how they deal with people. If you're too close to the point, they'll either eradicate you, or, depending upon your status, they'll tell you to piss off somewhere else and shut your mouth. So Hogs allegedly, according to the press release, paid $100,000 tax evasion fine on a $17 million profit. I've never known the ATO to back down from 1 cent that they think they're owed. You owe them 1 cent, they want it yesterday. They owe you 1 cent, they'll get around to it. $100,000 over $17 million, less than 0.1% tax on a $17 million movie profit. Now, talking of the ATO, you go for a job interview, say on a Friday, and you knock the interview out of the ballpark. The potential employer is rapt about you, wants you to start ASAP. Normally it's with Monday, unless he's really pressured for employees, might ask you to start work tomorrow. But let's just say that, okay, you start Monday. The very next thing that the potential employer does is he hands you a bunch of documents. Now, these documents might pertain to the company profile, what it does, what its rules are, what its protocols are, blah, blah, blah. But they'll also hand you a tax declaration form to fill out and bring back. Now, the tax declaration form set up in a way banking on the fact that people don't know this. The very first thing it says, fill out in bold capital letters using a pen. And it can't be a blue pen or a red pen. Usually they want it in a black pen. There's a reason for that too. You use a red pen, it indicates a sign of life force. You use a blue pen, it's a sign of royal status, blue bloods. That's why they say black pen. Now, so what happens? You fill out your you fill out the form as being requested to you by the questions or the way it's formulated. Fill out your name, bold capital letters using a black pen. What's the first thing you're doing? Attesting to being the government securitized entity, deceased entity that can't work. Physical impossibility, straight off the bat. People don't know this. So they fill out their John Doe, black pen, capital letters. And a little bit further down, in finer print, it says, you don't have to sign this document. However, if you don't, you may be taxed at 52%. Now, anybody who bothers to read it, as opposed to just skimming over it, because most people just skim over what they define as the useless shit and sign away. But if you actually bother to read it, that's what it says. Now, there is threat, blackmail, coercion, and if you wanted to push the intimidation tactic, you could. But the reality of it is, for most people, they're not going to want to work a 40-plus hour week and be taxed over half of their wages to do it, simply because they refuse to put their John Doe down. So it's a catch-22 form. How do you get around the problem? On one side of it, you're agreeing and attesting to being the government securitized entity. If you don't, their backup plan is to tax you over half your wage. Well, at the point of time, you can't do anything about it. But you can when it comes to tax return. Because what is a tax return? For most people, it's fill out your paperwork, return, put in a tax return. That's how most people comprehend it. What it actually means is to return the tax. It's a application to the ATO to return the tax. Tax return. Turn it back to front, return the tax. And, okay, what do? They do return some of the tax, a percentage of the tax, but they keep some too. And this is where it becomes another fraudulent thing. That as a contract, and it is a contract because you're signing your name, but it's an invalid contract for a number of reasons. One is, where's the equal contribution? What has the ATO put on the table as an equal contribution for you working 40 plus hours a week to which they're going to steal some of your money out of your account via your employer. None. They've provided none whatsoever. Where's the meeting of the minds? Well, there can't be, because they're not there when you're filling out the document to ask them questions. You're just given this document. There's no point in asking your employer, because he's an employer, not a tax accountant or chartered tax accountant. He doesn't work for the ATO. He works on behalf of the ATO. So there's no point in asking him. So it's an invalid contract. Plus, it's a fraudulent invalid contract, because they're wanting you to agree that you're the legal fiction, that you're the government securitized entity, and you confirm it by signing it. Hence, you don't have to sign this, but if you don't, you could be taxed at 52%. That's their blackmail ploy to get you to sign it, to get you to agree to being something you're not. But the way to get around it is you can't get around it at that point, but you can get around it come time for the tax return. All it has to be is a very well worded document. And that pretty much concludes the whole contract law theory, except that I've taken some of the theory and proven it to be fact with that ATO letter. So now I guess what the next video will be is, how do we divorce ourselves from the government securitized entity? And that will be in part 5, and that will be the final video that sums it all up. Everything that has a beginning has to have an end, and to run it to its fullest conclusion has to be, how do we get around, or how do we divorce ourselves from this? And I don't think people are going to like this, because they're going to be forced, if they really want to divorce themselves from the government securitized entity, they're going to have to sacrifice something, and that's the biggest problem people will have. You can't obtain something by not sacrificing something in return. It's offer and acceptance, contract law. And this is why a majority of people won't do it, because what they're going to be forced to sacrifice will absolutely just smash the shit out of their security blanket of everything they know, or what they perceive to know. And that's why most won't comply to it. But that's up to them. That's their call, it's their choice. Can't force it. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink it. And by the same token, you can lead people to the land of the truth, but you can't force them to accept it. So that's Contract Law 101 Part 4, and the final one, which might be tomorrow if you're lucky, if not it'll be the next couple of days, will be Contract Law 101 Ending Part 5. Until then, keep safe, love one another, look out for yourselves, and hopefully you start to see contract law all around you. If I've done my job effectively enough, not my job, but if I've done my mission in educating or attempting to educate people, if I've done it well enough or effectively enough, you'll start to see it all around you. You'll start to see it. First thing I suppose you have to get your head around is looking for it. Most people are oblivious to it because they don't bother looking for it. This comes to we didn't educate ourselves out past the indoctrination. We just went with the indoctrination and went, yay, I'm intelligent. Yep, you're intelligent for a Neanderthal that drags their knuckles behind them. Because they concerned themselves with irrelevant, useless shit, as opposed to educating themselves in things that matter pertaining to their lives. This is why Australia and the world is in the state it's in. We've left it to government and politicians to run our lives, and clearly they couldn't run a chook raffle in a poultry farm. Well, that's not necessarily true. They can run a country into the ground. They've had 51 years to do it that I'm aware of, and they've done it quite efficiently. Whether the country can bounce back from that and get rid of these tyrants is anybody's guess. I'd like to see it happen. I wish things went back to what I remember as a kid growing up in Australia. But unless there's actually a tsunami wave of getting rid of these dead shits, I can't see anything will change. In fact, I can only see things changing for the worse. And what it's going to require is the people to stand up and shouting kumbaya. If that's what makes them feel good, the people feel good, great, I'm happy for them. But it's going to take a lot more than kumbaya. I wouldn't be surprised if it degrades itself to the level of the Los Angeles riots in the 90s over the Rodney King case. That's what I fully expect, because I think that's about the only thing it's going to take. The government doesn't give a shit for what you say or what you think, but it does give a shit if you apply the same maxim as what has been applied to you, which is force. It's the only thing they recognise. When the coppers get physical with you, you got to make a choice. You've got to draw a line in the sand. Are you going to get physical, or are you going to run and hide and lose the line some more? They'll keep pushing until they push us off a cliff. Basically, that's what it comes down to. I mean, we're already seeing martial law in this country. They just haven't designated it as martial law. The ADF on site at bloody borders and whatnot, and there's rumours ADF are going to be or have been walking around with medical officers and police force vaccinating people. I don't know how much truth there is to that. It could be speculation, might be a futuristic thing. But at some point we are all going to have to draw a line in the sand and stand our ground. Win, lose or draw. Live or die. It's really unfortunate. But we only have the government to blame. And we have to accept some blame ourselves because we allowed it to happen. But anyway, that's all I've got for you tonight. Sweet dreams. Bye.